Hey everyone, and welcome back to Humankind. In this video we're going to cover off these 5 key things that I think are emerging flaws, weaknesses of Humankind. I covered them a little bit initially after the game's release, but I've taken a lot of feedback from you and played this game a heck of a lot. You can see here, in general, you guys are fairly positive about the game. 24% voted for excellent, 54% of you voted that it was great, the remaining 21% thought it was either sort of average or bad. It gets even more interesting though because I thought I'd delve a little deeper, and then I asked what is wrong with Humankind, and I gave you 3 of the 5 things that I've identified and I'd like to talk about today. Of note, pollution, or the sort of more broadly the climate change mechanics, were the most voted. So let's jump into these. Pacing, religion, pollution, war settlement, and finally, what's going on with the endgame and why do I not have a World Congress UN type structure in place? Let's jump straight in. Firstly, it's the sort of war settlement, diplomatic functions that surround war. Here you can see me besieging the city, and I have to say, those who are unfamiliar with me, who may not have seen my channel before, you should note, I think Humankind is a great game, and I think that's reflected not only in this wonderful combat system, but more broadly in the game as a whole, and the community seems to be roughly on board with me in that sentiment. However, there are some issues that need to be addressed and fixed to really polish this experience within its first sort of 6 to 12 months, that norming phase, before we start to see significant DLC expansions, i.e. bring in the base version of the game and really solidify it. In terms of war settlement, there are 2 big gripes that I think need to be fixed. First and foremost, multiple wars that are happening at the same time seem to ruin the war score element for those unfamiliar in Humankind. When you're fighting and engaging, there's a grievances system, not just for physical combat, but for other things as well. No-nos, right? Diplomatic incidents that you can push grievances against, and that supports your war score, i.e. how your population supports you in engaging with the combat. Now, war settlement, when there's multiple wars going on, A is fighting B, B is fighting C, but to make it really confusing, C is fighting A, right? There's this weird loop in combat, and it just doesn't work. When one party is forced to surrender due to low war score, it can sort of spring across into other combats and trigger really strange behaviors, and it needs to be fixed because it's so frustrating. The other thing sort of aligned with that is the fact that when you are the aggressor and you have driven their war support to 0, you are still forced to surrender. Sometimes that might make sense, but some cultures actually might want to just keep fighting, particularly if you still have the war support to do so, which I've had happen to me. Another bug bite another bug bite in what is overall, I'm going to leave that in what is overall a pretty good combat system, but we need to fix the diplomacy functions around it. Next up, I want to cover off pollution. This is the big bad boy, and you guys really brought that home in your comments, and I do agree. The pollution system was tacked on to the end of Humankind's development. We didn't even know it was going to be a thing. We weren't able to experience it in the beta, maybe because of the beta's restricted error limits, i.e. it was only sort of the early mid-game, or maybe it's because it wasn't ready. The developers have acknowledged it was a feature that they were adding late in the piece, and unfortunately it does feel that way. It's not innately a bad system, and I like the fact that there is a punishment for polluting the world. There absolutely should be in every case. The downside to the system is it's very stripped back. I don't even want to describe it as basic, which is, spoiler alert, how I'll describe religion later in this video. It's worse than basic. It's actually just not entirely functional. It displays up the top. You can see it's just displayed here now on screen. 20 pollution per turn, right up there above those little icons for the other AIs. And that's kind of all you get. You get a run-up of how much is sort of being generated per turn, but you don't get a sense of when do the levels change, right? When does this move from me slightly polluting the earth to really detrimental impacts on the natural environment, moving on to human life, and eventually gets to a point where literally it's an end condition for the game. The game ends if the world is no longer hospitable, thanks to pollution or nuclear weapons, as it were. It's a great system in principle, and I really like it. And I actually really like the sort of different things that they've added, the sort of filter that comes over the map to make it look polluted, to make it look more like a wasteland. I like it a lot, but fundamentally, it just doesn't quite work enough. Here I'm building train stations purposefully to try and generate pollution just to test with the system. And unfortunately, the fact that it doesn't have those clear indicators means we can't read it, we can't judge it. There are no diplomatic, real ramifications to it. More on that later when I talk about the World Congress, a particular thing that I'm passionate about. But overall, it's a system that's very stripped back basic, hard to read and understand, and unfortunately, it doesn't relate to the rest of humankind's world. And Humankind does such a great job at building a geographically diverse and interesting world to explore, yet we don't see, for example, other things that are often tied in with pollution in games, specifically climate change and the increasing severity, risk, and intensity of natural disasters, which are unfortunately altogether not present at the moment in Humankind. I do fully expect them to embrace it further when they work on this pollution system, which, by the way, they have acknowledged they are doing. Next up, another thing that they've acknowledged, and I think it's really important we talk about it now, it's religion. So, I've covered this a little bit already. If you've heard this, by the way, you can skip through. There are time cards in the description. You can bounce around between different sections of the video if you're bored with a certain one, but you want to hear me talk about another. But let's talk about religion. And in my opinion, the religious system in Humankind is actually not terrible. I actually quite like it. Personally, at a very personal level, I'm not a big religious player in 4X games. I never really have been, so I don't mind it's sidelined. However, this is not just about me. This is about having a religious or faith system that is engaging for the player and interesting and not cumbersome. What does Humankind do well? Well, it's certainly not a cumbersome system. It's very natural. It's very passive. It happens largely in the background. Sure, you can build your holy sites and select certain civics to give you more faith generation, but at the end of the day, aside from maybe opening your borders or opening trade with other empires to allow your religion to spread a little bit easier, there isn't really a lot of nuance to the system. It's very, as I've said, basic. The religious system is basic. It literally relies on the number of faith you're producing. Here you can see the overall religious spread, but again, it's very basic. Do you have more faith than them? If everything else is equal and there's not really a lot else to tinker with, then your faith will overtake theirs. The tenets, gotcha. The tenets themselves are quite interesting and varied, but they don't, again, relate enough to the wonderful world that Humankind builds. It builds a world with literally like 7 or 8 different layers of geography. Finally, in a launch title of a game, we actually have more than one naval tile. Navies are another issue for a separate video, but the actual ocean tiles themselves at least have some variety, right? Coastal tiles, then you have reefs, then you have certain things like the Great Barrier Reef, wonders that can be built or found in the ocean, and of course the whole, if your units sail out too deep and into certain rough tiles, they'll take damage. It's an interesting environment that the religion system doesn't take advantage of. And it's a real shame, because there are many ways that it could be strengthened. A few ideas that I've had, just to throw them around. I think it would be nice if we could set a general direction for our religion, whether that's managed through sort of a head of faith or a religious policy doctrine that's more fleshed out than the very simple civics decisions we currently have. It would be nice to embrace Humankind's sort of overall mantra of leading a journey. I don't want to be right into the detail moving individual religious units, but I'd still like to be able to set more of a direction to my religion and customize it in a way that's a little bit more unique and perhaps has a bit more flavor with either cultures that I'm playing or the world that I'm in. Next up, and fourthly for this video, I want to talk pacing. This is another big one that I've heard from a lot of you guys about. And in my experience, I've played a fair number of games now. Many of you may have joined me live during the live streams or watched the VODs afterwards. I respect the livers and the VODers equally. Thank you so much for joining me, and a huge shout out to all the super chatters and members. But anyway, let's talk pacing. Unfortunately, I think there are two issues at play here. The first is to do with game speed, and the second is largely to do with the technology tree. I think when people say that the pacing is wrong, what they're generally meaning is the tech tree or science generation is slightly off somehow. I do note that we unlock scientific buildings a little bit late in this game, and if you don't choose a specifically scientific culture, you can sort of flounder your way through the tech tree, and really, in many cases, and I know this isn't the same case for everybody, and I know there are ways to min-max it and absolutely surge in science, but in most playthroughs where scientific cultures aren't adopted and you're just playing sort of a general game across the yields, you will tend to find that you don't get to experience particularly the final era, the contemporary era's cultures, but also their technologies at all. The pacing is off. And as I say, it's not just the tech tree itself, there are broader era pacings. I think with the game speeds as well, we could maybe adjust the pacings there too. It's not just tinkering with tech trees and research speeds, but also with the game speeds themselves. I note many of you would prefer to have a longer speed. Give me 900 turns, give me 1200 turns. Heck, controversially, let me turn the turns off completely, which can be done, by the way, through mods and mod.io, but also, I'm sure, through innate game support moving forward. I do have a mod video as well if you'd like to see how to download. There's literally one mod on the store at the time of recording the video, and it was to turn the turn timer off by default across the board. But by and large, I think we could see some tweakings with the number of turns in these modes. Blitz is naturally very fast, but again, you don't quite manage to make it to the late game because it sort of bottlenecks everything. And then at the other extreme, the games are arguably not paced long enough. But overall, I think it does go back to the tech tree, because ultimately that determines what goodies you've got to play with, right? What buildings you have, what units you have, so on and so forth. Whether you can build them or utilize them is another question entirely, but at the end of the day, I do believe it's the tech tree that is the most significant bottleneck outside of some turn and pacing issues. Do let me know what you think about that, by the way. As you can see throughout this video, I've laced your feedback through it, and I really do appreciate it. Last but not least, and again, this is a personal one for me. That's right, gloves are off. We're getting personal, folks. It's the World Congress, or more broadly, international relations in the late game. Yes, Humankind's diplomatic system and the treaties that are involved in it are actually quite interesting, particularly once you unlock the alliance and you start to get these sort of mutually beneficial agreements that exchange science or civics. Indeed, the osmosis sort of features as well are kind of a fun passive element to diplomacy, but what we're lacking is that really fundamental, hard-cutting, late-game World Congress or United Nations type organization. I know that the World Congress is a difficult thing to build into 4X games. Trust me, I do. I've dealt with the mess that is Civilization 6's. My goodness, it's a mess. But also, really, Civ 5's, while fairly straightforward and easier to use, arguably, wasn't all that impactful either. And I think that World Congress systems are maybe particularly hard to design around the AI, right? The AI, something we haven't touched on in this video because I think they're doing a reasonable job at working on it. It's a difficult beast to tame. How do you create the human experience right now, in this moment in time, in an AI technology? Spoiler alert, pretty hard. Pretty hard for a game as complicated as literally simulating human existence. So I think I do actually have to step back and give them some credit, because I think by and large, the AI is actually good in this game. But will it continue to be a roadblock for many things, not just designing a World Congress? Most likely, yes, actually. Most likely, yes. Now, what would I like to see from a World Congress? Well, of course, I think it should bring players together in either this, the industrial era, or perhaps even a bit later in the contemporary era. Maybe slightly earlier, though, in early modern. I could see that being somewhat historically flavoursome, let alone accurate. By and large, though, across the board, the system needs to be able to pull every remaining player into the game and have decisions made. These decisions don't necessarily just have to be ban them from trade, but they can be reactive as well, right? Particularly when it comes to reacting to a player snowballing in the lead, reacting to pollution as well, another way to strengthen that system, and across the board apply both rewards and sanctions against your opponents. Folks, thank you very much for watching this video of my Humankind, really reflections on how the game could be better. I really do want to hear your feedback and thoughts, so please let me know in the comments below. I am so passionate about hearing them, and just because I don't reply to them doesn't mean I don't read them. Thanks very much, and I'll see you next time.